I was sitting in my dorm room when the phone rang, and when I saw Dad's name on the screen, I couldn't help but smile. He usually called on Sundays, because that was our little ritual that had been established for years and was rarely disrupted, but today was Wednesday, which was unusual in itself. "Hi, Dad," I replied, pressing the phone to my ear, expecting to hear his familiar warm voice, full of that restrained tenderness that he always knew how to convey even through the usual greeting. "Chloe, honey," he began, but there was something wrong with his intonation, as if an invisible weight was dragging down every word. "I need to have a serious talk with you. Can you come home?" I tensed up. My heart stopped for a split second, because Dad never dramatized or asked for something for nothing. "What happened?" I asked, not trying to hide the anxiety that came in waves, chilling my skin. "We should talk in person, please." His voice was flat, but I sensed he was holding back something important. I glanced at my calendar, quickly scrolling through my to-do list. The midterms were approaching, and every minute had to be devoted to studying. "I can come back in 2 weeks. Everything is fine." "Yes, it's okay." The pause is too long, too full of meaning. "I love you, Chloe." This conversation left behind a strange, sticky residue that wouldn't let go of me for a second. The 2 weeks I had to wait stretched out into infinity. I could barely concentrate on lectures and notes, because my thoughts kept returning to Dad's words, to the tension in his voice, which I had never heard before. When the day of the trip finally came, I threw the most necessary things into my bag and, trying not to wind myself up ahead of time, boarded the train heading to my hometown. The car rocked gently, and familiar landscapes flashed by outside the window, but instead of the usual feeling of comfort, I felt something like fear, a dim, deaf one that settled somewhere under my ribs. Margaret, my stepmother, met me at the door. Her usually reserved, always impeccably controlled face was tense, and when I stepped inside, she suddenly, without saying a word, hugged me tightly, which was extremely unusual for her. "He's in his office," she said softly, opening her arms and gesturing for me to follow her down the long hallway. I pushed the door open and froze. Dad was sitting at his massive oak desk, but it seemed that he had become smaller, shrunk, drowned in his clothes, which now hung loosely on him. His face was ashen, and there were deep shadows under his eyes. "Chloe," he smiled faintly, his voice sounding the same as it had that day on the phone, but now it was even quieter, even fainter. "Come here, honey." I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him, but when I felt his fragility, I suddenly realized how much he had changed. "Dad, what's going on?" I gasped, squeezing his fingers in my palms. He took a deep breath, as if gathering strength. "The doctors found cancer, dear. It's progressing. They don't think I have much time left." The room swam before my eyes, the world around me became unreal, blurry. I felt hands on my shoulders, Margaret, holding me as I struggled to breathe. "I'm so sorry," Dad whispered, barely audible. "I hope you can visit me more often. I want to spend as much time with you as possible." We spent the whole weekend together. I watched him speak, and his face came alive with memories of the past. He told stories about my childhood, how I went for the first time, how I said the first word, how one day I decided to paint a cat purple, and how he then washed the unfortunate animal for 2 days, but at the same time he laughed as if it was the best memory of his life. He was talking about Mom. "Your mom was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he said, and his eyes clouded over, as if he saw her in front of him again. "The day she entered the coffee shop, I spilled coffee on myself because I just stared at her, unable to take my eyes off her." Margaret quietly left the room, giving us space. Dad's voice became quieter as he told me how Mom fought the disease to the very end, how strong she was, even when she knew she wouldn't see me grow up. "I was 9 when she died, and a lot of that time has been erased from my memory, but now, listening to him, I felt like she was next to me again." After that weekend, everything changed. I started calling Dad every day, between classes, between lectures, and instead of coming once a month, I started taking the train every weekend because every minute I spent with him became the most important thing to me. Every time I called Dad, his voice sounded a little weaker than the previous time, but as soon as I started talking about my studies, student life, or just something insignificant, the old warmth returned to him, as if these conversations temporarily drove away his illness. He listened attentively, asked questions, and was genuinely pleased with my success, and although it seemed to me that I supported him, in fact, it was he who continued to support me, inspiring me with the belief that everything could still be good. At first, Margaret also seemed to be my ally in the struggle. She met me at the door, hugged me, asked me how the day was, offered me tea or something to eat, but over time something changed in her. Her welcoming hugs disappeared, her voice became cooler, something tense appeared in her behavior, and instead of warm greetings, I began to receive only a nod during dinner, as if my presence was something undesirable, annoying. At the table, Dad, trying not to notice this tension, tried to keep up the conversation. "How are your classes going, Chloe?" "What is it?" he asked, and I saw a shy smile appear on his face. "Okay," I replied, trying to sound casual, but glancing at Margaret, I noticed how her jaw was clenching. "I got an A for my psychology degree," I'd add, hoping to lighten the mood. "That's wonderful, honey." Dad was genuinely happy, but at that moment Margaret abruptly stood up, pushing back her chair with such a creak that it hurt her ears unpleasantly, and, without saying a word, rushed to the kitchen. The situation was getting worse every day. In October, Dad began undergoing chemotherapy, and the hospitalizations became longer and longer, until finally the house turned into a war zone. Tension literally hung in the air. Every word or movement was accompanied by the sound of slamming doors. Margaret almost stopped noticing me, ignoring even brief greetings, and I began to feel like a guest in this house who was not welcome. Slam. The door to the kitchen. Slam. Her bedroom. Slam. Bathroom. These sounds haunted me, accompanying every step, but I couldn't figure out what exactly I had done wrong, what had earned this icy wall between us. One evening, after returning from the hospital after a long day with Dad, I came home tired and hungry. The house was dark and cold, and there was no sound of the TV or the usual creaking of dishes. No food smells, no pots on the stove. I went into the living room and saw Margaret sitting on the couch, staring at her phone. "What's for dinner?" I asked, trying to hide my growing irritation. She raised her eyes and looked at me coldly, intently, and then replied, "I haven't cooked anything. I didn't expect to have to feed you." Her words sounded like a slap in the face. "What do you mean?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "I'm here every weekend." She put down her phone and crossed her arms over her chest. "You're here every weekend. If you want to eat, cook it yourself." I stared at her, stunned by her tone, which sounded not just tired, but something like annoyance, even anger. "What's going on, Margaret? Why are you acting like this?" "Nothing is happening." Her voice was laced with sarcasm. She grinned and shook her head. "I just think you come here too often." "My father has cancer," I said in a trembling voice. "Of course, I'll come to him." Margaret muttered something under her breath, turned away, and returned to her phone, completely dismissing me as if I wasn't even standing in front of her. I stood in the doorway, feeling resentment or anger rising in me, but instead of saying anything else, I turned around and went upstairs. In the evening, I lay in my bed, listening to the silence of the house, which was occasionally broken by the sound of a door slamming somewhere in the distance, and I wondered if I should tell my dad about everything. But I knew that he already had too many worries, that his treatment itself was already too heavy a burden, and the last thing he needed was to find out about the tension between his wife and daughter. After a month of intensive chemotherapy, Dad was finally discharged from the hospital. The doctors were careful in their predictions, but they sounded optimistic. His body seemed to be responding well to the treatment, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I could breathe a sigh of relief. Upon learning about this, I immediately booked a train ticket, impatiently waiting for the trip home, wanting to see Dad in a better mood than in recent weeks. The autumn air was fresh when I got out of the taxi at home that Friday afternoon. I immediately felt that something had changed. There were more cars parked in the driveway than usual, and one of them seemed particularly familiar to me, a sleek black Nissan that I remembered all too well. Mark. I felt my stomach tighten. If Mark was here, then Jessica probably was too. I hadn't seen my stepbrother and sister for over a year, and that was fine with me. Jessica, being only a year older than me, always made it clear that she considered herself superior to me, and Mark, 6 years older, always treated me as if I was too small to exist in his world. They were here now. And something told me that their arrival was hardly a good sign. The front door was unlocked, and when I entered the house, I was immediately enveloped in that familiar feeling of warmth and comfort that I always felt here, but at the same time I felt something alien, barely perceptible, as if the space around me had changed, ceased to be mine. Dad was sitting in his favorite armchair in the living room, looking tired, but to my relief, he was better than he had been in weeks. When he noticed me, his face lit up with a warm smile, and this sincere, native gesture momentarily dispelled all the anxiety that had settled in my chest since I arrived. "Here's my girl," he said, holding out his hand, and I immediately stepped forward, allowing him to hug me. "How are you feeling, Dad?" I asked, carefully studying his face, trying to determine how good he really was. Before he could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway, followed by Jessica and Mark. They were holding glasses of wine in their hands, and their laughter was ringing, almost too loud, as if the whole situation didn't bother them at all. "Oh, Chloe, you're already here," Jessica said, smiling with an exaggerated joy that I felt was somehow insincere. "Hi," I replied, trying not to sound annoyed. I apologized, saying that I would take my things upstairs, and as I went up the stairs, I heard them all laughing at something in the kitchen. That sound made me feel like a stranger in my own home, as if I had returned to my teenage years, when it always seemed to me that there was an invisible wall between me and them that I would never break through. When I reached my bedroom, I suddenly froze. The door was open, and when I looked inside, I immediately realized that something was wrong. My old vintage movie posters were gone, replaced by reproductions of Jessica's paintings, the ones that always seemed tasteless and pretentious to me. The purple bedspread, which I brought back as a teenager and which has always been a part of my space, has disappeared, and instead there is a white blanket with lace and, it seems, an endless number of decorative pillows on the bed. I went to the closet and opened it. Jessica's clothes were hanging inside. On my dresser, where my things used to be, her cosmetics were now spread out, scattered as if she had lived here for a long time. Indignation grew in his chest. I turned around and almost ran downstairs, feeling my hands shaking with rage. "Margaret, may I speak with you in private?" I asked, barely keeping my voice calm. She nodded, still smiling her fake, overly welcoming smile, and followed me into the living room. "Why is Jessica in my room?" I tried to keep my voice calm, but my voice betrayed how angry I was. "Oh," she waved her hand dismissively, as if I had raised a very minor issue. "Well, since they're moving, it makes sense to give Jessica a bigger room. You only come here on weekends." I gritted my teeth. "This is my room. I always have been." "There are 2 perfectly good guest rooms upstairs," she replied with the same affected indifference. "Do you really want to upset your father over something so trivial?" Her words cut into me like a knife blade. I slowly turned my gaze to Dad, who was talking to Mark at that moment and seemed to look really cheerful for the first time in a long time. There was a blush on his face and he seemed to enjoy the moment. My shoulders slumped. "Okay. Which guest room can I stay in?" "In the little one at the end of the hallway," Margaret smiled sweetly. Jessica's stuff is in the other one. I pressed my lips together without saying another word and headed upstairs to carry my bag to the tiny room that was now reserved for me. When I went inside, I was overwhelmed by disappointment. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a double bed and a small chest of drawers, and the walls were painted a dull beige that I'd always hated. The window faced directly onto the brick wall of the neighboring house, leaving no chance of at least some kind of view. The next morning, we all gathered for breakfast. Dad was sitting at the head of the table, picking at his special diet meal that Margaret had prepared for him, while everyone else was eating stew, the aroma of which wafted through the kitchen, reminding me of childhood. But the atmosphere at the table was tense. The silence was almost deafening until I decided to speak. "So, Jessica," I said, trying to sound casual but firm at the same time, "how long do you plan to stay here?" Jessica looked up from her plate and smiled that smug grin I remembered from our teenage years. "Oh, I'm not just staying," she drawled with forced lightness. "I'm moving out. Forever. Someone has to be here to take care of Dad," Jessica drawled casually, idly twirling her fork in her hands, her voice sounding almost charitable, but there was an undisguised smug note in it that made me clench my fists under the table. "Since you're so busy with college and all your important things, Mark and I have decided to take on this responsibility." I felt my face flush with indignation. "I come every weekend," I retorted sharply, trying to keep my voice calm, but feeling the anger creep into my voice anyway. "It's not enough days off," Jessica interrupted me, shrugging her shoulders as if discussing something insignificant. "Dad needs constant care and attention, not random visits between your exams." I looked at Dad, hoping that he would intervene, but he just smiled softly, as if he was glad that all his children were around again. "Don't worry, Chloe," Jessica continued, her voice sweet but slightly metallic. "I can handle it. I will gladly sacrifice my time to be by his side." Mark cleared his throat, setting his glass of wine on the table. "Yes, I'm staying too," he said, lightly, as if announcing a decision that was non-negotiable. "I have a remote job scheduled, so I can work from here. I think a family should stick together in difficult times." I felt resentment rising in me. I looked at Margaret, and what I saw in her eyes made me shudder inwardly, undisguised satisfaction, a satisfied smile, a look full of triumph. She was sitting there, holding a glass in her hands, looking like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. I opened my lips, ready to object, but at that moment my gaze fell back on Dad. He looked happy, he was smiling, and there was a lightness in his eyes that hadn't been there in months. The words stuck in my throat. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my dorm room, intently working on an article, when suddenly the phone rang. When I looked at the screen, I saw the name of Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, and something inside me tightened. "Chloe, dear," her voice was trembling, and I immediately understood what she was going to say. "Your father. He got worse. The doctor said you need to come home right away." I didn't waste a second. I didn't even pack my things properly. I just grabbed the first clothes I could find, stuffed them into my bag, stormed out of the room and, taking the stairs 2 at a time, rushed to the college administration, where I applied for an emergency academic leave. All this time, I had only one question in my head: why did Aunt Sarah call me? Why not Margaret? Why not Jessica or Mark? They were there, in the house, next to Dad. Why am I learning about this from someone else? The ride seemed endless. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything but the blurred outlines of the autumn landscape. All my thoughts were there, at home, next to my dad, whom I might never see again the way he was the last time I saw him. When I finally got home, I knocked on the door. There was no response. There were sounds of movement inside, muffled voices, and the TV was on, but no one bothered to come over. I knocked again, harder this time. 5 minutes have passed. 10. Finally, the door opened and Margaret appeared on the threshold. She was standing in front of me in her silk robe. Her hair was immaculately coiffed, and her face was irritated, as if I were a traveling salesman who interrupted her quiet evening. "What are you doing here?" "What is it?" she asked in a cold, almost indifferent tone. I wasn't going to waste time explaining. I pushed past her into the house. "I took a sabbatical. I'm moving back home to Dad." "Don't worry," Margaret said calmly, following me into the foyer, her voice sounding too flat, too indifferent. "He was taken to the hospital 2 days ago. He's on life support." I stopped dead in my tracks. 2 days ago? I asked, feeling a storm rising inside me. "And you didn't think it necessary to tell me?" "You should go back to college, focus on your studies," she continued, crossing her arms over her chest, ignoring my anger. "There's nothing you can do for him right now." I squared my shoulders and looked her straight in the eye. "Actually, Margaret," I said slowly, firmly, "this is my home too. And I have every right to be here." Margaret tilted her head slightly, and her thin lips curved into a smug smile. "Don't worry, darling," she whispered, her voice almost gentle, but there was something icy in it. "It won't be long." I didn't have time to process what she meant, but I didn't care. I dropped my bag in the tiny guest room, barely touching the dull walls with my eyes, and immediately turned around, running back out of the house. Dad's room was in the intensive care unit. When I entered, the room was filled with the sounds of medical equipment, the steady, measured beeping of monitors, the faint hiss of an oxygen machine, the dull noise of N4 drip. He lay motionless among the tangle of tubes and wires, his face so pale that it almost blended into the whiteness of the hospital sheets. I slowly walked over to the bed and gently touched his arm. She was cold. A soft voice said from behind me, "Miss Matthews?" I turned around and saw a man in a white coat standing in the doorway. "I'm Dr. Roberts," he said, smiling softly, but there was seriousness in his eyes. "I watched your father's treatment." I swallowed, trying to control the lump in my throat. "How is he?" I asked, already knowing that I wouldn't like the answer. Dr. Roberts' face softened, and there was sympathy in his gaze, but that didn't lighten the burden of the words he uttered next. "I need to be honest with you," he said softly, as if he was afraid that the volume of his voice might break the fine line between hope and inevitability. "Your father's cancer has spread aggressively. Chemotherapy is no longer effective. The doctors are doing everything possible to make him comfortable, but you should prepare for the worst." The words rang in my ears like a metallic blow on glass, leaving a hollow feeling in my chest, but I nodded, as if I had expected to hear exactly that. I didn't cry, I didn't collapse into a chair, I didn't ask how long he had left, because I knew that the doctor wouldn't answer, knowing that there were no exact answers to such questions. Instead, I stayed in the ward until the end of visiting hours, sat by my dad's bedside, talked to him, although I understood that he could not hear me or could not answer, but I continued to tell him about college, about friends, about the coursework for which I had recently received an excellent grade, about how the psychology teacher was late for the lecture again, and like the entire course, he made an unspoken bet on exactly what time he would show up. I said anything to fill this terrible silence, broken only by the steady hum and beeps of life support devices. When I was asked to leave, I squeezed his hand one last time, looking at his pale, emaciated face, and promised that I would return in the morning. When I returned home, I felt that everything inside me was shrinking from tension. Margaret, Jessica, and Mark were sitting in the living room watching TV, and what struck me most was that they looked completely relaxed, as if nothing had changed in their lives. None of them even looked up when I entered, as if I was just a ghost that had slipped by, disembodied and inconsequential. Jessica lazily reached for the remote control and, meeting my gaze, slowly, deliberately turned up the volume. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, waiting for at least some sign, at least a formal question about Dad, but the silence remained steady, filled with artificial laughter from the announcers on the screen. No one said anything, Without giving myself time to get emotional, I turned around and silently went upstairs. The next few days turned into a miserable, repetitive existence in which I seemed to be on the edge of reality, hovering between two worlds. I spent my days in the hospital, sitting next to Dad, telling him everything that came to mind, hoping that somehow he could still hear me. I returned home late, where I was greeted by a house full of indifference, in which people lived their lives, leaving me no place at the dining table or even a simple nod. They were talking around me, discussing plans, exchanging news, joking, eating the food Margaret had prepared, leaving no portion for me or even a hint of an invitation. The doors closed in front of me as if I were just a shadow, and it happened so often that I no longer had to ask myself if they were doing it on purpose. One afternoon, I returned home earlier than usual. Dad was supposed to have tests at the hospital, and they told me that visits were temporarily limited. When I entered the house, I heard Margaret talking on the phone in the kitchen, her voice full of businesslike excitement. "Yes, I want a complete reconstruction," she said confidently, and the sound of her voice at that moment sounded louder than ever. "New floors, demolish the wall between the living room and the dining room, completely redo the kitchen." I froze in the doorway, feeling icy anger coursing through my veins. "Are you seriously planning to renovate your house right now?" My voice sounded harsh, and Margaret, noticing me, quickly covered the microphone of the phone with her hand. She didn't look embarrassed, didn't feel a drop of guilt. On the contrary, she looked at me with a slight annoyance, like a child who interferes in an adult conversation. "Life goes on, Chloe," she said, calm and carefree. "We can't spend all our time just lying around." I gritted my teeth. "This isn't even your house to fix," I blurted out, realizing that I couldn't contain the anger boiling inside anymore. Margaret raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "Not yet," she said, her voice filled with such self-satisfaction that I wanted to take a step back. I looked at her, and slowly, but inexorably, the full meaning of her words began to sink in. She thought she was going to inherit the house. She really believed that when Dad died, everything would belong to her. All of her behavior in recent weeks, the sudden hostility, the urge for her children to move, the renovation plans, suddenly made sense. She was already acting as if this house belonged to her, as if I was just a nuisance that would soon disappear. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and went to my room, but it wasn't until I closed the door behind me that I allowed myself to smile. Because Margaret had no idea that this house had never belonged to her father. This house was my mother's, inherited by her parents, and before she died, she made sure that it passed to me. The ownership has been in my name since I was 9 years old. Dad only lived here because he was my legal guardian. He paid taxes, kept the house in order, but he could never bequeath it to someone else. Margaret spent 11 years thinking that she had married into a beautiful home that would one day be hers. But that was never the truth. I've spent the last week in the hospital watching Dad slip away. The doctor said he probably couldn't hear me anymore, but I kept talking anyway. I told him about my childhood, about how we went to the beach and collected shells, about how he taught me to ride a bike, about how as a child I drew him a birthday card on which we were depicted as superheroes. I kept talking even when he couldn't breathe without the machine anymore. He died on Tuesday at 3:47 a.m. I was holding his hand when it happened. Margaret immediately took over the funeral arrangements, acting as if it were her sacred duty, as if she was the only one who had the right to decide how to see my father off. She assumed the role of a grieving widow, dressed in mourning, with the air of a woman bearing the unbearable weight of loss on her shoulders, and managed everything as if it concerned only her. She didn't consult me about anything, not about flowers, not about the service, not even about the obituary. Everything was organized according to her taste, without taking into account what Dad himself might wish or what would be important to me. The funeral turned out exactly as one would expect from Margaret, flashy, expensive, as if it were not a farewell ritual, but an exhibition of status. She chose the most prestigious funeral home in the city, ordered huge flower arrangements, hired a string quartet that played sad melodies, perfect for creating the right atmosphere. She stood at the entrance, artfully dabbing the corners of her eyes with an expensive monogrammed handkerchief, her face an expression of refined sorrow, honed to perfection, and flanked by Jessica and Mark, creating a spectacular picture of an ideal family sharing the pain of loss. I couldn't look at them without disgust. When the last person had left, when the flowers had been removed, and artificial grief was no longer needed, Margaret found me in the foyer of our house. Or at least what she considered her home. "Well," she said with a light exhalation, from which there was no trace of sadness. "I think it's time for you to pack your things." Jessica and Mark stood behind her, arms crossed over their chests, like bouncers in an expensive club, ready to expel an uninvited guest. I kept a neutral expression on my face. "I think we should wait for the will to be read," I replied calmly. "A will?" Margaret twitched, and a shadow of annoyance flashed across her face, but she quickly regained control of herself. "It's just a formality. But it's okay if you insist on dragging out this process." And they made the next week hell. They slammed the doors loudly when I passed by, defiantly discussed how to redo their house, not hesitating to talk about it in my presence. They left passive-aggressive notes saying that my things were taking up too much space, and pretended to be surprised when I entered the kitchen or living room, as if I were an unwanted ghost. I hardly left my tiny room, just counted down the days until the reading of the will, realizing that it would be the last facet after which everything would fall into place. Finally, the day has arrived. Mr. Patterson, my father's lawyer, came to the house, a middle-aged man with the manners of a man who had seen enough family quarrels over inheritance to be no longer surprised by anything. We were all gathered in the living room. Margaret, Jessica, and Mark were sitting on the couch together, and I was sitting in my mother's old armchair by the window, the only place in this house where I still felt like myself. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat, took out the papers, and began to read. "To my wife Margaret and her daughter Jessica, I leave my jewelry collection, including my late wife's diamond earrings." Margaret and Jessica exchanged pleased smiles. "I'm leaving my new Mercedes of the latest series to Mark." Mark's face instantly brightened, and he nodded in satisfaction, as if this was exactly what he had expected. "I leave a sum of $100,000 to my beloved daughter Chloe." I saw Margaret's smile widen, but she didn't say a word, just looked expectantly at Mr. Patterson. He folded the papers. Margaret waited a moment, then leaned forward, putting on an exaggerated expression of innocence. "And the house?" she asked, choosing her words carefully so as not to sound too impatient. "Who did my husband leave the house to?" Mr. Patterson looked at her calmly. "There's no mention of the house in the will, Mrs. Matthews." Margaret tensed, her face paled, but after a second the blood rushed to her cheeks, and they turned bright red. "That's impossible," she hissed, gripping the armrests of the sofa. "Check it again. A will should be invalid if it does not mention the main asset." I couldn't hold back any longer. I cleared my throat, and when I spoke, my voice was calm but firm. "Actually," I said, looking directly at her, "the house is not mentioned in the will because my father could never give it away." Margaret blinked. "What?" "This house belongs to my mother," I continued, enjoying the moment of complete silence. "She left it to me in her will when I was 9 years old. My father just lived here as my guardian until I reached adulthood." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel 3 pairs of eyes staring at me, filled with shock, disbelief, and maybe even panic. Mr. Patterson, who was clearly uncomfortable with the tense atmosphere, awkwardly gathered up his papers and, avoiding eye contact with anyone present, stood up. "I have to go," he said dryly, putting the documents back in his briefcase. "Once again, I am sorry for your loss." He hurried to the door, clearly wanting to leave the place as soon as possible, leaving me alone with 3 people whose faces at that moment resembled masks frozen in an expression of genuine horror. "You can't just throw us out on the street." Margaret clenched her fists, her chest heaving with indignation, and her eyes flashed lightning. We've lived here for so many years. We made this house cozy. We took care of him. I slowly raised my gaze, looking around the trashed living room. Pieces of wallpaper lay on the floor, books, photographs, and broken knickknacks were mixed among them. Everything she had touched in her madness had been destroyed. If that's your idea of caring, Margaret, I said coldly, folding my arms across my chest, then I'm even afraid to imagine how you feel about things that you really don't care about. Jessica and Mark stood in the doorway, tense, nervous, but silent. They might have wanted to accuse me, but even they understood that their mother had gone too far. 2 weeks, I repeated. You have exactly 2 weeks to find another place to live and move out. No. Margaret shouted, but her voice was shaking. I'll talk to a lawyer. I'll find a way. Find a way to what? I tilted my head slightly to the side, watching her confidence slowly fade. Challenge a will that never existed? Take the house that never belonged to Dad? Try to convince the judge that you have a right to property that you have nothing to do with? Do you really want to go through with this? Margaret opened her mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. This house belongs to me, I continued calmly but firmly. And you know it. All your confidence was built on a mistaken assumption, and now that reality has hit you in the face, you don't know what to do. I turned to Jessica and Mark, who were still silent, as if they were waiting for their mother to find a way out of the situation. You should start looking for a place to live, too, I said in a flat voice. I understand that you used to think that this house will always be yours, that you can endlessly benefit from Dad's generosity, but it ends here. 2 weeks. And not a day more. Jessica exhaled sharply, crossing her arms over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. Do you really want to do this, Chloe? She said, tilting her head, her voice full of venom. After everything we've been through? I grinned in disbelief. We? I repeated, feeling my irritation rising. Have we passed? No, Jessica. You weren't there when Dad was dying. You didn't sit by his bed, hold his hand, or tell him stories, even if you couldn't hear anymore. You didn't come to the hospital, you didn't ask the doctors how he was. You were here, in the house you were going to take over, while I was there with him. So don't tell me we've been through something together. Jessica looked away, but I saw her fists clench. You've always been like this, she said. Smug, stubborn, selfish. You think you're the best because you're lucky to be born to the right mother. I don't think I'm any better, I replied calmly. I just know that I was with Dad when it was important. But you don't. Jessica turned away, her face burning with humiliation. Mark, who had been silent all this time, finally exhaled and slowly ran his hand through his hair. Okay, Chloe, he said, his voice suddenly flat. I get it. We'll move out. Margaret whirled on him, her face contorted with indignation. What? Mark, you can't just. We're moving out, he repeated more firmly. This is not our house. We knew this from the very beginning. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Mark just shook his head. We've been wasting our time, Mom. It's time to finish. She looked at me, her lips twitching, and in her eyes I saw not only anger, but also something else, helplessness. She always thought she could control the situation, but this time her power crumbled like a house of cards. I took a step closer, looking her straight in the eye. 2 weeks, I repeated for the last time. That's all you have. Margaret turned and left the room, her robe billowing like the cloak of an offended queen. Jessica followed, and Mark paused for a second, looked at me, and there was something like recognition in his gaze, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but understanding. I never wanted this, he said softly. But you let it happen, I replied. He nodded, as if accepting my condemnation, and then he left too. I was left alone in the ruined living room, surrounded by scattered books, scraps of wallpaper, and overturned furniture. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that this house really belonged to me. "Jessica," I began, my voice flat but steely. "You can have everything Dad left you in his will. Jewelry, a car, anything. But if you don't get out of here before sunset, I'll call the police again. And this time they won't stop with a warning." She flushed, her eyes flashed with rage, her lips curled into a contemptuous smile, but she saw that I wasn't bluffing. "You're vile, selfish," she began, but I slowly picked up the phone and, without looking away, pressed the screen, dialing 911. That was enough. They realized that the battle was lost. The next few hours were filled with irritated footsteps, loud slams of doors, muttered curses bursting through clenched teeth. Margaret and Jessica were rushing around the house, noisily stuffing clothes into suitcases. Mark was packing his things in sullen silence. All three were scurrying between rooms, making several trips, loading their belongings into cars. I followed them closely, making sure they took only what was rightfully theirs, and nothing more. Margaret tried to discreetly hide some silverware from my mother's old set in her suitcase, but when I silently showed her the phone in my hand, her lips tightened into a thin line, and she angrily threw the spoons back into the drawer. Mark led his brand-new inherited Mercedes out into the driveway and got in, waiting for the others to load their bags. Jessica and Margaret loaded up their jewelry boxes, giving me looks full of venom. As Margaret walked past me to the door, she stopped, paused for a second, and leaned a little closer, hissing, "You're going to regret this." I looked her straight in the eye and slowly smiled. "You're just as selfish and arrogant as your mother," she added with contempt. My smile widened. "Thank you," I replied calmly. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Margaret made a face of anger, but she didn't say anything else. When their cars disappeared around the bend, I didn't waste any time. I called the locksmith. He arrived an hour later and changed all the locks in the house. I stood in the doorway, watching him work, at the same time making a list in my head of everything that needed to be restored. The living room looked like a disaster zone. Torn wallpaper hung from the walls in pathetic patches, furniture was overturned, books and knickknacks lay on the floor. In the dining room, the curtains were in a crumpled heap, and the rod on which they hung was bent so badly that it could no longer be repaired. It will take several weeks to recover. I called Aunt Sarah, the only person who saw through Margaret from the beginning. "The vultures have flown away," I said when she picked up the phone. "Thank God," she breathed. "How serious are the injuries?" "Pretty serious," I admitted, surveying the mess around me. "I'll have to hire contractors to get everything in order. But I can't stay here, I have to get back to college." "Don't say anything else, dear," she said soothingly. "I'll see to the repairs." "Thank you, Aunt Sarah." "And what are you going to do with the house when it's ready?" I looked at the cracked mirror, at the torn edges of the wallpaper, at the ruined carpet, and shook my head. "I'll rent it out," I replied. "Under a normal contract, with normal tenants. No more freeloaders." Aunt Sarah laughed. "It's a wise decision, sweetheart." After the conversation, I walked around the house for the last time. Despite the chaos, despite the destruction, for the first time in a long time, I felt that it was easier to breathe here, as if an invisible weight had disappeared, pressing down on the walls and absorbing into the air. I ran my fingers over the smooth surface of the wall, remembering how my mother loved this place, how she took care of every detail, how she wanted this house to always remain in the family. The next morning, I left for college, leaving my keys and insurance documents with Aunt Sarah. As the train pulled out of the station, I felt something I hadn't felt since Dad got sick. Easement. This house now belonged only to me. He will help me pay for my education with the rental income. But the most important thing is that he will stay in the family, just as his mother wanted. I never saw Margaret, Jessica, or Mark again. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about how things could have turned out differently. If only they were kind. If they treated me like a family member instead of a nuisance. But most of the time, I just didn't think about them at all.